Welcome to the sixth video in this review of basic Greek morphology based on 12 core patterns. We now come to the final major features of the Greek nominal system, beginning with the third declension adjectives. There are no new endings to learn since these adjectives use the same core pattern as the third declension nouns, and many of the same modifications we saw in the nouns will also take place in the adjectives. Our first pattern is the adjective pas upon. Here we have a 3-1-3 pattern because it has the third declension forms in the masculine and neuter and the first declension in the feminine. Note that the masculine forms use almost the same features we saw in pattern 4 for third declension nouns. The main difference is that sigma in the nominative singular. The neuters also have familiar features. Note the final tau dropping out in the nominative and accusative singular due to the zero form ending. The feminine forms use common first declension endings, so there's nothing new in those endings. The stem is changed through a sigma being added, which causes the new tau to drop. So if you memorize for vocabulary all three nominative forms, pas upon, then you have built into your memory that change of stem in the feminine, as well as the nominative singular forms for the masculine and the neuter. So there's really nothing new to learn here, but note that this paradigm of pas upon is not only an example of an adjective using third declension endings, it's also one of the 12 core patterns to learn. And that's because it will play an important role when we come to the participles. So pay special attention to this pattern and learn it well. But let's move on to something a bit more challenging. In this next pattern for third declension adjectives, we have another 3-1-3 pattern, and now we have stem shifts and vowel contraction like pattern 5 of the third declension nouns. The masculine and neuter represent a form of stem shift we didn't see in the nouns. Pattern 6 of the third declension nouns has a stem ending in upsilon, but it doesn't change. But here we see a stem shift between an upsilon in the nominative and accusative singular and an epsilon elsewhere. As you see, the third declension forms in the masculine and neuter use the same endings as the nouns. Indeed, the masculine forms are the same as 5b nouns, but with an upsilon instead of an iota. The neuter nominative and accusative singular is regular with the zero form ending, but it may look a bit funny. So if you memorize euthus, eutheia, euthu, and not just the masculine nominative euthus, then you'll have that odd-looking neuter form in your brain. Now, in fact, I mentioned this upsilon sigma nominative form when we were looking at pattern 5 nouns. It's one of those 5 nominative endings in patterns that have a stem shift. Looking now at the feminines, you see that they have the standard ending, so recognizing the case, number, and gender should not be a problem. The stem change in the feminine is probably the unusual thing to note, and again, if you memorize euthus, eutheia, euthu, then you'll have that in your brain as well as the unusual nominative singular forms. Now we move on to a form of third declension adjective that only has 2 sets of endings, so we have a 2 termination adjective for the third declension. In this pattern, the stem is epsilon sigma that you can see there in the neuter, nominative, and accusative plural that have the zero form ending. Everywhere else, the sigma drops out, and so you're left with the stem ending in good old epsilon, like we saw in pattern 5. The masculine nominative singular has lengthened the epsilon to an eta, so it's distinguished from the neuter singular, nominative, and accusative forms. And so here's our other nominative singular form for third declension patterns that have a stem shift. So now we've seen all 5 of these patterns for nouns and adjectives in the third declension that have stem shifts that go back to lemmas that have these endings. Probably the trickiest feature in this pattern is the alpha ending, which contracts with the epsilon stem to produce eta. So it looks like a first declension nominative singular feminine ending, and here it shows up in 3 places in this paradigm: accusative singular, masculine or feminine, and nominative and accusative plural neuter. Now we already saw this epsilon alpha contraction in the neuter of the pattern 5a nouns there in the plural. So this pattern is not introducing a lot of new features, but it still takes a bit of getting used to. And as always, the context and the lexicon will help you sort out any questions you have about what form you have in the text. And there are also the web resources of Perseus and Bible Hub that we looked at in an earlier video, which will help you sort out the parsing at least. Now after that complex pattern, let's look at another 2 termination adjective pattern that's a bit easier. Notice that this one has stems ending in nu. Pattern 3 of the third declension nouns also had stems ending in nu, and you see the endings are the same in the masculine and feminine as nouns in pattern 3. The neuter forms use the same endings we've seen throughout the third declension. The zero form in the nominative and accusative singular is regular, but it may look a bit odd, and so again, memorizing both the nominative forms is an easy way to plug that form into your head. So let's see a few examples. Here, aletheia looks like a first declension nominative singular, in which case that would be its lexical entry. But you also know that an eta can be a pattern 5a third declension noun, and that would look like this in a lexicon. Again, the genitive singular and the article tipping you off that this is not a second declension pattern. And of course the eta shows up in our two termination adjectives, which will look like this in a lexicon. So this eta ending here can be in three different patterns, so which one is it? Well, the lexicon's got to sort it out. Here are the 6 words in Danker's concise lexicon that begin with alpha, lambda, eta, theta, and you see the only one that fits is aletheis s. So we've determined that our word here is from this adjective, but now which of the 3 different possible parsings? That we have to figure out from the context. Here it's functioning as a predicate complement of the equative verb ein. Now the subject is panta, and in this context that's a nominative plural neuter. So aletheia here is the nominative plural neuter. Here's another example of the same form of the same word. In this case it's the direct object of lege. Now as a direct object you expect that to be an accusative. But is this the masculine feminine accusative singular or the neuter accusative plural? Either one of those could make sense. But when you dig deeper into the lexicon you find that this is actually part of an idiom. So here's BDAG, Danker's large lexicon, and you see that it actually cites ta aletheia legein as an idiom. So we know we're dealing with the neuter plural. And there's John 19:35 to confirm that. Now if you look over this verse, you'll find that aletheia is modifying karen. It's the true grace of God. And since karen is a feminine noun, aletheia is going to be the feminine accusative singular to match karen. These examples represent some of the more difficult features of the nominal system in basic Greek, so congratulations on at least beginning to get them under your belt. We're going to move on now to a few final items which are a bit easier. Our final set of adjectives consists of 2 important words whose patterns are a mixture of declensions. If you look these over, you'll see they're basically a 2-1-2 set of endings, but the 4 places I've underlined are third declension endings. An easy way to remember the distinctives of these patterns is by memorizing all 3 nominative forms. That approach will give us the nominative singular forms, and since one of those is neuter, that means the accusative singular comes along as well. So that leaves only the masculine accusative ending to learn, and that nu is regular ending, so you'll probably be able to recognize one of those forms once you've sorted out the third declension features that we've looked at. The final part of the nominal system are the patterns for the pronouns. The first and second person pronoun patterns contain some features we've seen in the nouns, but they also have some distinctive features. So this is another of the core patterns to learn. You probably recall that autos, aute, auta serves as the third person pronoun. It follows a regular 2-1-2 pattern apart from that neuter nominative and accusative singular that doesn't have the final nu. So once again, if you memorize autos, aute, auta, you'll be able to recognize these neuter forms when you meet them. So here's a summary of what we've seen in this video. We've looked at third declension adjectives with various forms of stem ending, nu tau, epsilon upsilon shift, the epsilon sigma epsilon, and then the endings in nu in the stem. Looked at 2 words that have a mixed pattern, and then looked at the personal pronouns. So these are the main features of the approach I'm offering for a review of the nominal forms. And walking through the material briefly like we've done in these videos hopefully has prepared you to read through the chapter and using and enjoying Biblical Greek to fill in some further details. Now as I note in the book, there are further patterns that are less common, as well as words that are simply irregular. So to study this material that goes beyond the basic level, the books by Funk and Mounts are especially helpful. So use one or both of those would be my recommendation. My goal has been to make the material easier to learn for the sake of reading, and these resources will provide a more precise and detailed discussion of some of these patterns, as well as fill in the less common patterns and features. In the next video, we'll continue on to the verbal system.